It wasn't a criminal, a witness, or even a citizen who walked into the police station that rainy afternoon. It was a tiny, soaked puppy. Shivering, eyes wide with desperation, he stumbled across the floor as if he knew exactly where to go. At first, the officers laughed in disbelief. But then, the little stray whimpered, raised his trembling paw, and scratched at the door as if begging them to follow. What the officers discovered when they did would leave hardened men fighting back tears. This wasn't just a stray. This was a cry for help that changed everything. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The police station was unusually quiet that afternoon. Papers rustled softly on desks, radios buzzed faintly in the background, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Officers leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee and finishing reports. It was an ordinary day, the kind where nothing out of the ordinary was expected to happen. The sound of rain tapping against the windows added to the calm, steady rhythm of routine. No one could have imagined that the silence was about to be broken in the most unexpected way possible. The heavy glass doors suddenly swung open, creaking against the force of the wind. Every head turned, expecting a frantic citizen rushing in with news of trouble. But instead, the officers froze. Standing in the middle of the floor, dripping wet and trembling, was a tiny stray puppy. His fur was soaked, clinging to his fragile frame, and his wide, pleading eyes scanned the room. For a moment, no one moved. The absurdity of it caught them off guard. A puppy walking into a police station on its own. A few officers chuckled, exchanging surprised glances, but the puppy didn't wag his tail or act playful. He whimpered softly, lowering himself onto the cold floor as though begging for help. His little paws left wet prints with every shaky step forward. Something about his presence felt different, urgent, almost desperate. The room, once filled with quiet laughter, shifted into a hush as the puppy staggered closer. His body trembled with exhaustion, his tiny ribs visible beneath the wet, muddy fur. He wasn't just lost, he was worn down by something heavier. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't the playful, tail-wagging energy of a curious stray. This was a silent plea for help. His wide, glistening eyes locked on the men in uniform, as though he understood this was his last hope. The sight pierced through the hard exterior of seasoned officers used to far grimmer scenes. One officer, Mark, pushed back his chair and crouched low to the ground. He extended his hand slowly, speaking in a soft tone meant to calm. The puppy flinched but didn't back away. Instead, he lowered his head and inched forward, pressing his damp nose against Mark's palm. A lump formed in Mark's throat. He could feel the rapid heartbeat, pounding with fear yet driven by trust. The dog wasn't simply seeking shelter from the storm. He was trying to say something. Behind them, two other officers watched intently, their smiles fading into concern. "Poor thing," one whispered, shaking his head. The puppy then did something unexpected. He lifted his trembling paw and gently placed it on Mark's knee, staring into his eyes with a look so hauntingly human it left the room in stunned silence. Mark froze as the puppy's paw pressed against his knee. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, almost as if the little creature was begging him to understand. The puppy whimpered softly, his eyes never breaking contact, then pulled back and turned toward the open doorway. His ears perked, his body trembling, yet he let out a faint bark as if urging them to follow. The officers exchanged puzzled looks. Dogs came into the station from time to time, but none had behaved like this. Something about the urgency in his tiny frame sent shivers through the room. Slowly, the puppy padded back to the door, pausing to glance over his shoulder. His wet paw prints trailed across the floor like breadcrumbs, each step deliberate. Mark rose to his feet, his instincts telling him this was no ordinary stray. "He wants us to follow," Mark muttered, his voice low but certain. The other officers frowned, unsure whether to take it seriously, but the look in the puppy's eyes was undeniable. It was as if he carried a burden too big for his small body. The little dog barked again, sharper this time, and scratched at the door. Rain poured outside, the sound echoing against the glass. Mark grabbed his jacket and nodded. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "Show me." And with that, the silent plea became impossible to ignore. The rain fell harder as Mark stepped outside, the puppy trotting ahead with surprising determination. His small frame shook with every step, but he didn't slow down. Puddles splashed beneath his paws, yet he pressed forward, stopping only to glance back to make sure the officer was still following. Mark's boots splashed against the soaked pavement as he quickened his pace, his gut tightening. This wasn't random wandering. The puppy knew exactly where he was going. Something waited at the end of this path, and Mark dreaded what he might find. They turned down a narrow alley, the walls lined with dripping bricks and the scent of damp, trash heavy in the air. The puppy's pace quickened, his whimpers turning sharper, almost frantic. Then he stopped abruptly beside a collapsed cardboard box near the dumpster. His little nose pushed against it, pawing desperately. Mark crouched low and lifted the soggy flaps with careful hands. The sight inside froze him to the core. There, huddled together, were two smaller puppies, lifelessly weak, shivering, and soaked to the bone. Their breaths came in shallow rasps, their tiny bodies trembling. The stray hadn't come for himself. He had come for them. Mark's throat tightened, his chest aching as realization struck. This puppy hadn't run to the police for shelter. He had run for help, to save his family. For a long moment, Mark couldn't move. His hands hovered above the shivering pile of fur, his heart pounding as the rain poured harder around them. The stray puppy let out a desperate whine, nudging one of the weaker pups with his nose, as if begging Mark to act quickly. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He scooped the tiny bodies into his arms, feeling their fragile weight against his chest. They were barely hanging on, their eyes dull, yet pleading for a chance to live. The sight struck him harder than any case he'd ever worked. By the time they returned to the station, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Officers who had chuckled minutes earlier now stood frozen, their faces pale. When Mark carefully placed the two frail puppies on a dry blanket, silence filled the room. The stray curled beside them instantly, wrapping his little body around his siblings, whimpering softly as if apologizing for not saving them sooner. Tears pricked at the corners of more than one officer's eyes. One veteran officer, hardened by years on the force, wiped his face discreetly. "I've seen a lot in my life," he whispered, "but never anything like this." The room, once filled with paperwork and chatter, now carried a different weight. This wasn't just about animals. It was about loyalty, love, and the desperate courage of a tiny puppy who refused to give up. The station erupted into action. Blankets were fetched, bowls of warm water prepared, and a call went out to the nearest veterinary clinic. Mark cradled the weakest puppy in his arms as officers worked together, their usual hardened demeanor replaced with urgency and compassion. The stray never left their side. He pressed himself against his siblings, licking their tiny faces as though reassuring them that help had finally arrived. In that moment, it was clear he wasn't just a survivor. He was their protector, their voice, the reason they had been given a second chance. At the clinic, the veterinarian worked tirelessly, checking vitals, administering fluids, and warming the pups. Hours felt like days as the officers waited, anxiety heavy in the air. Finally, the vet emerged with a tired smile. "They're weak, but they'll make it," she said softly. Relief washed over the room, some officers letting out sighs, others wiping at their eyes. The stray wagged his tail for the first time, as though he understood. He had succeeded. His desperate run for help had saved his family. Weeks later, the puppies thrived under the officers' care, and adoption offers poured in. Mark, however, already knew what his heart wanted. Smiling, he whispered to the brave little stray, "You found your home now." And with that, a story born in rain and despair ended in love and new beginnings.